In the harsh winter of 1889, a pregnant widow and her 2 children face impossible odds on the Montana frontier. Alma Carlisle stands alone against the brutal elements, her husband dead and her cabin half-built when the first blizzard threatens to claim everything. With contractions starting and her 9-year-old twins struggling to help, she has nowhere to turn and no one to depend on. Then Clayton McQuade, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, rides past their failing homestead on Christmas Eve and makes a decision that will change both their lives forever. But when a man who has everything meets a woman who has lost it all, can 3 days of shared labor really build more than just walls? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana wind carried the promise of death across the frozen prairie, and Alma Carlisle could taste it in the air. She stood before the half-completed cabin that mocked her husband's dreams, her breath forming white clouds that disappeared as quickly as hope itself. The structure leaned like a drunk man against the bitter December sky, its walls rising only to her shoulders before ending in jagged, unfinished edges that let the cold slice through like knives. Thomas had been so certain when he'd filed the homestead claim 6 months ago, his calloused hands tracing the boundaries on the surveyor's map with the reverence of a man touching scripture. 160 acres, Alma, he'd whispered in their tent that first night, the deed pressed between them like a promise. Enough to raise our children proper, with room for the cattle to graze and a garden that'll feed us through any winter. The land deed now lay folded in her apron pocket, creased from handling, its legal language as foreign and unforgiving as the territory itself. But Thomas hadn't counted on the fever that took him in October, burning him hollow in 3 days while the twins watched from the corner of their canvas shelter. He'd whispered instructions with his dying breathwear to sink the well, how to brace the walls against the wind, which timber to cut first, but words couldn't swing an axe or square a log. Now Alma faced the approaching winter with nothing but his dreams and a determination that felt as brittle as the ice forming on the creek each morning. Reed stood beside her, his 9-year-old frame already showing the promise of his father's height, though his shoulders hadn't yet filled out to carry a man's burden. His hair, the same copper shade as Thomas's, caught what little sunlight filtered through the grey clouds. In his small hands, he gripped a hatchet almost too heavy for him to lift, its blade dulled from inexpert use against the frozen logs. "Mama, this one's got a crack running through it," he said, pointing to a timber they'd dragged from the grove a quarter-mile away. His voice carried the careful precision of a child trying to sound older than his years. "Papa always said cracked wood won't hold when the snow gets heavy." Alma knelt beside her son, running her fingers along the split in the wood. Thomas had taught the boy well in their brief time together, but knowing and doing were different creatures entirely. "You're right, sweetheart. We'll need to find another one." She didn't mention that finding good timber meant another day of work they couldn't spare, another day closer to the killing cold that would arrive whether their walls were finished or not. Rosie appeared around the corner of the cabin, dragging a branch nearly as long as she was tall. Unlike her twin brother, she carried their mother's slender build and dark hair, but her green eyes blazed with the same stubborn fire that had driven Thomas to stake his claim in this unforgiving place. Snow dusted her woolen coat, and her cheeks burned red from the wind. "I found more kindling by the creek," she announced, dropping her burden with a grunt, "and I saw tracks in the mud rabbit tracks. Maybe we could set some snares like Papa showed us." The thought of rabbit stew made Alma's stomach clench with hunger, but setting snares required time and skill they couldn't afford to spare. Every daylight hour had to go toward completing the cabin before the real cold arrived. Already, frost formed on the water bucket each morning, and the creek ran slower each day as ice crept inward from its banks. "That's good thinking, Rosie," Alma said, pulling her daughter close for a moment. The child's body felt warm and solid against her side, a reminder of what she fought to protect. "But right now, we need to focus on getting these walls up. Come spring, we'll have time for hunting." If we live to see spring, she thought but didn't say. The twins carried enough worry already, without adding her fears to their burden. The baby kicked against her ribs as if sensing her anxiety, and Alma pressed a hand to her swollen belly. 7 months along, maybe 8, she'd lost track of time in the chaos following Thomas's death. The child moved constantly now, as if trying to escape the cramped space, and each kick reminded her that her deadline grew shorter with every passing day. A newborn wouldn't survive in a tent, not in a Montana winter that could freeze a man solid in a single night. She straightened slowly, her back aching from the weight she carried, and surveyed their meager progress. In 2 weeks of back-breaking work, they'd managed to lay the foundation stones and raise walls on 3 sides. The 4th wall remained a skeleton of upright posts, waiting for the horizontal logs that would complete the structure. Above them, the sky pressed down like a grey wool blanket, heavy with unshed snow. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away across terrain that became impassable once the deep snows came. In town, the women whispered behind their hands about the widow, trying to prove up her husband's claim, shaking their heads at the folly of it. Some offered charity with pitying smiles, but charity came with strings, attached expectations that she'd give up the homestead and move back east where women belonged, safe and useless in parlors heated by other men's labor. But Thomas had believed in this place, had seen something in the rolling grassland and the creek that ran clear even in drought years. He'd pointed to the ridge where they'd build their home, describing the view they'd have of the valley, spread below them like a green carpet when spring returned. His faith had to count for something, had to be worth the struggle that consumed her days and haunted her dreams. "Mama, look," Reed said, pointing toward the horizon where a dust cloud rose against the grey sky. "Someone's coming." Alma shaded her eyes with her hand, squinting at the approaching rider. Visitors were rare this far from the main road, and unexpected company usually meant trouble. She moved protectively in front of the twins, her hand finding the handle of Thomas's old Colt revolver tucked into her belt. She'd never fired it at anything larger than a rattlesnake, but desperation could steady even trembling hands. The rider took shape as he drew closer, a man on a fine horse, both of them moving with the easy confidence of those accustomed to covering long distances. Even at a distance, she could see the quality of his gear, the way his coat fit his shoulders, the silver glint of his saddle fittings. This wasn't a drifter or a neighboring homesteader come to borrow tools. Clayton McQuade reined in his bay, gelding 50 feet from the cabin, his pale eyes taking in the scene with the careful assessment of a man who'd learned to read situations quickly. At 57, he carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of someone who'd earned his position through hard work and harder decisions. His weathered face spoke of decades under the western sun, but his hands remained steady on the reins, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Clayton McQuade. I own the Circle M spread about 10 miles south of here. I was riding Boundary when I noticed your smoke." He paused, his gaze moving from Alma's defensive posture to the twins clutching their tools to the half-finished cabin that listed like a ship in rough seas. "Looks like you could use some help." Alma's chin came up, pride stiffening her spine despite the exhaustion that made her bones ache. She'd heard of Clayton McQuade. Everyone in 3 counties had. He owned more land than some eastern states, ran cattle by the thousands, and wielded enough influence to make or break smaller ranchers with a word in the right ear. What would such a man want with a struggling widow and her half-built homestead? "We're managing just fine, Mr. McQuade," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "I thank you for your concern, but we don't need charity." Clayton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, of the stubborn courage that kept a pregnant woman swinging an axe when any sensible person would have given up weeks ago. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots crunching on the frozen ground as he approached the cabin. "This isn't charity, ma'am," he said, running his hand along one of the upright posts. "This is neighborly common sense. Winter's coming hard this year. I can feel it in my bones." And that baby you're carrying doesn't care much about pride when it comes time to be born." The directness of his words hit Alma like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on proving she could manage alone that she'd almost forgotten the most important truth. This wasn't just about her anymore. The baby, the twins, they all depended on decisions she made in the next few days. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford if it meant risking their lives. "I don't have money to pay for help," she said quietly, the admission scraping her throat raw. "Did I mention payment?" Clayton asked, already moving toward the pile of logs. "Seems to me a man rides past a neighbor in need. He's not much of a man at all." He hefted one of the timbers, testing its weight and straightness with practiced hands. "Besides, I've got some time on my hands. My foreman's handling the winter feeding, and a man can only sit by the fire so long before he starts feeling useless." Reed stepped forward, his young face serious with responsibility. "Are you really going to help us, Mr. McQuade? Because we've been working real hard, but there's still so much to do, and Mama gets tired carrying the baby." The simple honesty in the boy's voice seemed to reach something deep in Clayton's chest. He knelt to Reed's level, his weathered hands gentle as he examined the boy's hatchet. "I reckon I am, son, but I'll need you and your sister to show me what your papa taught you about building. Think you can handle that?" Reed's face lit up with the first genuine smile Alma had seen from him since Thomas's death. "Yes, sir. Papa said a man's got to know how to build his own home, or he's not really free." "Your papa was a wise man," Clayton said, standing and turning back to Alma. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but that baby's going to come whether this cabin's finished or not. Let me help you give your family a fighting chance." Alma looked at her children Reed, trying so hard to be the man of the family, Rosie carrying branches bigger than herself, both of them thin from rationed meals and hollow-eyed from worry. Then she looked at Clayton McQuade, this unexpected stranger whose presence felt like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to voice. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she pressed both hands to her belly. Thomas's voice seemed to whisper in the wind that swept across the prairie. "Take help when it's offered honest, Alma. Pride never kept anyone warm." "All right, Mr. McQuade," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. "We'd be grateful for your help, but I want you to know this isn't charity. When this cabin's done, and my family's safe, I'll find a way to repay your kindness." Clayton nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. "I wouldn't expect anything less, Ma'am. Now, let's see about getting you folks a proper roof over your heads before that storm I smell gets here." As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the frozen ground and making the canvas of their temporary shelter snap like a flag in a gale. The scent of snow hung heavy in the air, and the light was already beginning to fade, though it was barely past midday. Winter was coming to the Montana frontier, bringing with it the test that would determine whether Thomas Carlisle's dream would survive in the hands of his widow and children. But for the first time since her husband's death, Alma felt something besides desperation filling her chest. She felt hope. Christmas Eve arrived with a bite in the air that made every breath feel like swallowing ice. Clayton McQuade had returned at dawn, true to his word, leading a pack mule loaded with proper tools and seasoned lumber from his own mill. The worn leather gloves on his hands spoke of decades spent working with wood and rope, and as he unpacked his gear, Alma noticed how naturally he moved among the construction materials. "First thing we need to do is square up what you've already built," Clayton said, running his hands along the uneven wall joints. "Your husband had the right idea, but these corners need to be tighter if they're going to hold against the wind." He pulled a carpenter's square from his pack, its metal edges gleaming despite years of use. "Reed, come here and let me show you something your papa might not have had time to teach you." The boy hurried over, eager to learn from someone who clearly knew his trade. Clayton positioned the square against the corner joint, showing how the logs should fit together like puzzle pieces. "See how this one's sitting proud of the others? That's going to let cold air whistle right through come January. We need to notch it deeper." Alma watched from where she sorted through Clayton's donated supplies, her hands moving automatically, while her mind wrestled with accepting so much help. The lumber he'd brought was better than anything Thomas had managed to cut straight-grain pine that would hold firm against the worst weather. Each board represented value she couldn't repay, generosity that made her stomach clench with gratitude and shame in equal measure. "Mr. McQuade," she began, but he held up a gloved hand. "Clayton," he said without looking up from his demonstration with Reed, "and before you start worrying about payment again, remember that good neighbors look out for each other. Today you need help. Tomorrow, maybe I'll need something from you." He caught her eye briefly, and she saw something there beyond simple charioteer, loneliness that matched her own, carefully hidden beneath years of self-reliance. Rosie appeared at Clayton's elbow, having appointed herself his unofficial assistant. "My mama knows lots of things," she announced, with 9-year-old certainty. "She can birth calves and fix broken wheels and make soup from nothing but bones." "Is that so?" Clayton's weathered face creased into what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Sounds like your mama's got more skills than most folks I know." The simple validation made Alma's throat tighten unexpectedly. Since Thomas's death, every interaction with neighbors had carried undertones of pity or disapproval. Poor Alma, trying to do a man's work, too stubborn to accept that she was beaten. Clayton's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her competence felt like cool water after a long drought. They worked through the morning in comfortable rhythm, Clayton directing while all 3 Carlisles contributed according to their abilities. He showed Reed how to use a draw knife to shape the logs, praised Rosie's eye for selecting the straightest pieces from the timber pile, and consulted with Alma about the cabin's layout as if her opinions carried weight. By midday, they'd straightened 2 walls and begun work on the 3rd. The improvement was dramatic. What had looked like a child's fort that morning now resembled an actual dwelling, its corners tight and its walls rising with purpose toward the grey sky. "We'll need to think about the roof before much longer," Clayton said during their brief break for cold biscuits and coffee. "Weather's been holding, but I can smell snow coming. Maybe tonight, definitely by tomorrow." As if summoned by his words, Alma felt the familiar tightening across her belly that had been coming more frequently in recent days. She pressed her hand to her side, breathing carefully until the sensation passed. "Not yet," she told herself, "not until the cabin was finished and the children were safe." But Clayton's sharp eyes missed nothing. "How far along are you, if you don't mind me asking?" 7 months, maybe 8, Alma admitted. "It's hard to be certain. Time got away from me after Thomas died." Clayton nodded thoughtfully. "My late wife carried 2 babies, lost them both before their time, but I remember how she looked near the end. You've got that same restless energy, like your body's making ready whether you are or not." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about loss surprised her. Most people, especially men, avoided mentioning pregnancy and childbirth as if the topics were somehow indecent. Clayton treated them as natural facts, no different from discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "I'm sorry about your wife and children," Alma said softly. "Sarah and I had 15 good years before the fever took her," Clayton replied, his hands never pausing in their work on the log notching. "The baby's well. Some things aren't meant to be, I reckon. But seeing you fight so hard for your family reminds me that life keeps pushing forward, even when we think we can't take another step." Reed looked up from where he was practicing with the draw knife. "Is that why you're helping us? Because you miss your family?" The directness of the question might have offended another adult, but Clayton seemed to consider it seriously. "Partly, I suppose. But mostly because your mama's doing something brave, and brave folks deserve support when they're trying to build something good." "Papa always said brave wasn't about not being scared," Rosie added, dragging another log over to their work area. "He said it was about doing what needed doing even when you were scared." "Your papa was right," Clayton said. "Fear's just information. It tells you when something matters enough to be careful about it." As afternoon wore toward evening, the wind picked up and the temperature began dropping noticeably. Clayton worked with increased urgency, directing them to focus on getting the 4th wall framed before darkness fell. The children responded to his quiet authority without question, and Alma found herself relying on his experience more than her pride wanted to admit. When the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood. They had 4 walls standing and the basic framework for a roof. It wasn't finished. They still needed to chink the gaps, install a door, and complete the actual roofing, but it looked like a home instead of a hope. "We'll need to work by firelight for a while longer," Clayton said, already gathering deadfall for a bonfire. "I want to get the roof beams in place tonight. Once the snow starts, it'll be harder to work up high." They labored by the light of crackling flames that threw dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Clayton moved with sure-footed confidence in the dim light, his years of experience guiding him where younger men might stumble. The twins fetched and carried, with the determination of children who understood that adult concerns had become their own. Near midnight, as they secured the last of the roof supports, Alma felt another contraction grip her stronger this time, lasting long enough to make her catch her breath. When it passed, she found Clayton watching her with concern. "How often?" he asked quietly. "Not regular yet," she said, "but more often than yesterday." Clayton nodded, his expression serious. "We need to talk about what happens if that baby decides to come before we're finished here." The possibility she'd been trying not to think about hung between them like smoke from the dying fire. A winter birth in an unfinished cabin, with no doctor within 50 miles and no experienced women to help it, was the nightmare that woke her in the cold hours before dawn. "I've delivered calves and foals," she said, attempting to sound more confident than she felt. "How different can it be?" "Different enough," Clayton said gently, "but I've assisted with human births before, lost my nerve after Sarah died, but the knowledge is still there if we need it." The casual way he offered such intimate assistance should have scandalized her, but Alma felt only gratitude. In this harsh place, survival trumped social conventions. If Clayton McQuade was willing to help bring her child safely into the world, she'd worry about propriety later. "Tomorrow, we finish the roof and get you moved inside," Clayton said with finality. "Christmas Day or not, this baby's going to have a proper home to be born in." As they banked the fire and prepared to settle for a few hours of sleep, Alma looked at the cabin that had taken shape around them. The walls stood straight and strong, the roof beams promised protection from the weather, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she could imagine her family not just surviving but thriving in this place. Clayton spread his bedroll near the fire, close enough to tend it through the night, but far enough away to preserve appearances. The twins curled up in their shared blankets, exhausted from the day's work, but smiling with accomplishment. "Thank you," Alma said quietly, the words encompassing more than she could easily express. "Thank me when that baby's sleeping safe in a warm cabin," Clayton replied. "We're not finished yet." But as she lay listening to the wind whistle around their makeshift shelter, Alma felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the solid certainty that they would, in fact, finish what they'd started. With Clayton's help, Thomas's dream would survive, and their children would have a home worthy of their father's sacrifice. The storm could come, winter could test them, but they would be ready. Christmas morning dawned grey and bitter, with ice crystals forming on the inside of their canvas shelter despite the fire Clayton had kept burning through the night. Alma woke to find him already working, his breath forming white clouds as he sorted through lumber by the pale light. The man seemed to require less sleep than most folks, as if urgency drove him harder than fatigue could slow him down. Reed emerged from the blankets, rubbing his eyes, immediately reaching for the small, whittling knife that had belonged to his father. Thomas had given it to the boy just weeks before his death, showing him how to carve simple toys and useful tools from scraps of wood. Now Reed carried it everywhere, a tangible connection to the man who would never finish teaching him the skills he'd need as a frontier adult. "Morning, Mr. Clayton," Reed said, his voice still thick with sleep. "What do you need me to do first?" Clayton looked up from his work, and Alma caught something in his expressiona recognition of the boy's earnest desire to contribute, tempered by awareness of how much responsibility had fallen on such young shoulders. "First, you can show me how your papa taught you to test wood for soundness. I've got some pieces here that might work for the door frame, but I want your opinion on which ones are best." The request wasn't mere kindness, Alma realized. Clayton genuinely valued Reed's input, treating the 9-year-old's knowledge with the respect usually reserved for adult craftsmen. Reed straightened with pride, pulling his knife from its leather sheath and running the blade carefully along each board's grain. "This one's got a knot that goes all the way through," Reed said, pointing to a flaw Alma wouldn't have noticed. "Papa said knots like that make wood weak at the worst times. And this one," he tapped another board with the knife handle. "Hear how it sounds hollow? That means it started rotting from the inside." "Your papa taught you well," Clayton said, setting the flawed pieces aside. "A man who can't read wood properly will find himself rebuilding everything twice." Rosie appeared with her arms full of pine boughs, her cheeks red from the cold, but her eyes bright with purpose. "I gathered these for the roof," she announced. "Mama says pine needles help keep the rain out until we can get proper shingles." Clayton examined her offering with the same seriousness he'd shown Reed's wood selection. "These are perfect," he said. "Green enough to lay flat, but not so fresh they'll shrink and leave gaps. You've got good instincts for this work." The praise made Rosie beam, and Alma felt her heart squeeze at how hungry her children were for adult approval. Since Thomas's death, she'd been so focused on basic survival that she'd had little energy left for the small encouragements children needed to flourish. They worked through the morning with increasing efficiency, each person settling into tasks that matched their abilities. Clayton handled the heavy lifting and precise cutting, while Alma managed the assembly work that required steady hands but less physical strength. The twins fetched materials and provided extra hands wherever needed, their natural eagerness channeled into useful contributions. By noon, they had the roof structure completed and were beginning to lay the pine bough underlayment. The work required careful attention. Each bough had to overlap properly to shed water, and gaps had to be filled with smaller branches and moss to prevent drafts. "Up in the mountains, I've seen cabins roofed this way last 20 years, Clayton explained as they worked. "Not as fancy as split shingles, but it keeps the weather out and uses what the land provides." Alma found herself watching Clayton as much as she worked, noting how he moved with economical precision, never wasting motion or effort. His hands, despite their obvious strength, showed remarkable gentleness when handling delicate tasks. She wondered about the life that had shaped such capabilities, the experiences that had taught a wealthy cattleman to work alongside a struggling widow without condescension. "Clayton," she said during a brief rest, "can I ask you something personal?" He looked up from the roof beam he was notching, his pale eyes patient. "Ask away." "Why are you really here? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words, but a man in your position must have dozens of demands on his time. Why spend Christmas helping strangers build a cabin?" Clayton was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working automatically while he considered his answer. "When Sarah was dying," he finally said, "she made me promise something. She said wealth without purpose was just a burden, and that I shouldn't let losing her turn me into a man who forgot how to see other people's needs." He paused, running his thumb along the edge of his work. "I reckon I've been forgetting that promise lately. Living alone, managing the ranch through hired men, keeping people at arm's length because it was easier than risking more loss. Then I rode past here yesterday and saw what you were trying to accomplish." He met her eyes directly. "Sometimes a man needs to remember who he's supposed to be." The honesty in his words hit Alma unexpectedly. She'd assumed his help came from simple Christian charity, or perhaps masculine pride in his building skills. To learn that it represented something deeper, a deliberate choice to honor his late wife's memory by serving others made her see him in an entirely different light. "Sarah sounds like she was a wise woman," Alma said softly. "Wiser than me, certainly," Clayton replied. "She had a way of seeing straight to the heart of things. Would have liked you, I think. You've got the same kind of stubborn courage she admired." Reed looked up from where he was practicing, notching techniques on a scrap piece. "Mr. Clayton, were you scared when your wife died?" The question hung in the cold air like visible breath. Most adults would have deflected such directness from a child, but Clayton seemed to consider it seriously. Terrified, he admitted, not just of being alone, but of forgetting how to care about anything beyond my own grief. Fear can make a man selfish if he lets it. Mama gets scared sometimes, Rosie said matter-of-factly. I hear her crying at night when she thinks we're asleep, but she still gets up every morning and works on the cabin. Alma felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to have her private struggles exposed. But Clayton nodded with understanding rather than judgment. That's what brave looks like most of the time, he said. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving forward despite it. As afternoon wore toward evening, they focused on completing the roof and beginning work on the cabin's interior. Clayton had brought oil-treated canvas that would serve as temporary walls until they could properly chink the log gaps. The material would keep out the worst of the wind and cold, while still allowing them to complete the finish work. Working inside the cabin for the first time felt momentous to Alma. The space was small, perhaps 12 feet by 16, but it would house her family through the winter and beyond. She could already envision where the beds would go, where she'd place the cooking area, how the children would have space to play during the long months when snow made outdoor activity impossible. We'll need to dig a root cellar, Clayton said, noting the direction of her thoughts. Can't store food safely without proper cold storage, and you'll want a place to preserve vegetables come spring planting season. The casual way he mentioned spring and planting made Alma realize he assumed they'd not just survive the winter, but establish a permanent home here. The confidence in his voice bolstered her own hopes, making Thomas's dream feel achievable rather than merely desperate. As they worked, Reed stayed close to Clayton's elbow, absorbing every technique and explanation with the intensity of a boy who understood he was receiving his real education. The whittling knife never left his hands, and he practiced each new skill on scraps of wood until his movements became smooth and sure. You've got natural talent for this, Clayton observed as Reed successfully completed a complex joint. Your papa would be proud of how quick you're learning. Reed's face lit up at the praise, but then grew serious. Do you think Papa can see us building his cabin? Clayton paused in his work, clearly understanding that his answer mattered enormously to the grieving boy. I believe the people we love never really leave us, he said carefully. Maybe not in ways we can see or touch, but in the knowledge they gave us and the love they left behind. Your papa's hands guided yours when you made that cut, just like his dreams guided your mama when she decided to finish what he started. The philosophical weight of the conversation seemed natural rather than forced, arising organically from the work that brought them together. Alma found herself grateful not just for Clayton's practical help, but for his willingness to engage seriously with her children's deepest concerns. As darkness approached, they had achieved more than seemed possible. The cabin stood complete except for the door and some finish work. Inside, the space felt warm and protected, despite the cold wind that rattled the canvas walls. For the first time since Thomas's death, Alma could imagine her family not just surviving but thriving. Tomorrow we install the door and get you properly moved in, Clayton said as they banked the fire for the night. After that, it's just detail work, important, but not urgent. Alma nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion. In 2 days, this stranger had transformed her impossible situation into something manageable. More than that, he'd given her children hope and purpose, treating them as capable partners rather than burdens to be protected. Clayton, she said as they prepared for sleep, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. Don't thank me yet, he replied, but his tone carried warmth rather than dismissal. Thank me when that baby's sleeping safe in a proper home. As she settled into her blankets, Alma allowed herself to believe that such a moment might actually come to pass. For the first time in months, the future held promise instead of merely the hope of survival. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow, but inside their nearly finished cabin, 3 generations of the Carlisle family slept peacefully, protected by walls raised through the partnership of a widow's determination and a wealthy stranger's willingness to honor his late wife's memory by serving others in their time of need. The second day of their partnership dawned with frost covering everything in silver lace, and the first snowflakes beginning to drift down like ash from a distant fire. Clayton arrived before sunrise, bringing with him the scent of wood smoke and the quiet confidence of a man who had slept well despite spending the night in a drafty lean-to rather than his own comfortable home. Rosie met him at the cabin door, her small hands clutching a pressed wildflower she'd preserved between the pages of her mother's Bible. The bloom had once been bright yellow prairie sunflower that had caught her eye during their first week on the homestead, when summer still held the promise of easy living, and Thomas had been alive to share her discoveries. "I saved this from when Papa was still here," she said, offering the delicate specimen to Clayton with the solemnity of a child, sharing her most precious possession. "Mama says flowers are God's way of painting hope on the world, even when everything else looks brown and dead." Clayton accepted the gift with the reverence it deserved, holding the fragile petals up to catch the early light. "Your mama's got wisdom," he said. "This little flower kept its beauty all through the hard times, just like your family's kept its strength. That takes a special kind of courage." The comparison made Rosie straighten with pride, and Alma felt her heart clench at how desperately her children needed such affirming words. Since Thomas's death, she'd been so focused on physical survival that she'd had little energy left for nurturing their emotional needs. Clayton's natural way with children filled a gap she hadn't even realized existed. They resumed work on the cabin with increased urgency, driven by the steadily falling snow and the knowledge that real winter was announcing its arrival. Clayton showed them how to properly chink the log gaps with a mixture of mud, moss, and clay that would harden into an effective barrier against wind and cold. "The secret," he explained as they worked, "is getting the right consistency. Too wet, and it won't hold. Too dry, and it'll crack when the logs settle. Your hands will tell you when it's right. It should feel like thick bread dough." Alma found herself working shoulder to shoulder with him, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same materials. Each contact sent an unexpected awareness through her, a reminder that she was still a woman despite months of viewing herself only as a mother and survivor. The realization unsettled her. She'd been Thomas's wife for 12 years, and the idea of noticing another man felt like a betrayal of his memory. But Clayton's presence was impossible to ignore. He moved with quiet competence, his weathered hands gentle whether he was hefting logs or showing Rosie how to mix chinking material. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to being heard. But he listened to her opinions with genuine attention, treating her insights as valuable rather than merely polite. "You've got good instincts for this work," he said as she successfully completed a particularly difficult section of chinking. "Most folks rush the process, but you're taking time to do it right the first time." The praise warmed her more than it should have. "Thomas always said anything worth doing was worth doing properly," she replied. "He'd spend hours on a single joint if that's what it took to make it right." "Smart man," Clayton said. "I can see his influence in how you've raised your children. They've got his dedication and your determination." As the morning progressed, neighbors began appearing on the horizon. First the Hendersons from 3 miles east, then the Mulligans from across the creek, drawn by smoke from their fire and curiosity about the wealthy rancher's presence at the widow's homestead. Alma watched their approach with mixed feelings, knowing that news of Clayton's assistance would spread through the sparse community like wildfire. Sarah Henderson, a stern woman whose disapproval could freeze water at 50 paces, rode side-saddle with her back straight as a fence post. Her husband, James, followed at a respectful distance, his expression carefully neutral. The Mulligans, Patrick, and his grown son, Michael, brought their own tools, clearly intending to contribute rather than merely observe. "Morning, Alma," Sarah Henderson said, her sharp eyes taking in Clayton's quality clothes and expensive gear. "Heard you had some help with your building project." "Mrs. Henderson," Alma replied carefully. "Mr. McQuade has been kind enough to lend his expertise to getting the cabin finished before the weather turns." Sarah's gaze shifted to Clayton, who touched his hat brim politely but continued working without apparent concern for her scrutiny. "Mr. McQuade," she said, "generous of you to take time from your own affairs to help out here." "Neighborly thing to do," Clayton replied evenly. "Winter doesn't wait for anyone, and Mrs. Carlisle's got a family to protect." The simple way he deflected any suggestion of impropriety impressed Alma. He neither apologized for his presence nor felt compelled to justify his actions beyond basic human decency. His calm confidence in the face of community judgment spoke to a man comfortable with his own moral compass. Patrick Mulligan dismounted and approached the cabin, his experienced eye assessing their progress. "Fine work," he said approvingly. "You've got the corners true and the gaps well chinked. Mind if we lend a hand? Many hands make light work, as my dear mother used to say." The offer of help transformed the atmosphere from one of judgment to one of community cooperation. Soon, 8 adults were working together, sharing tools and techniques, while the children fetched materials and provided extra hands wherever needed. The cabin began to take on the finished appearance of a real home, rather than a desperate shelter. Clayton worked alongside the other men without any acknowledgement of his superior wealth or social position. He deferred to Patrick's expertise in roofing, praised James Henderson's skill with a drawknife, and accepted suggestions from Michael Mulligan about the best way to hang the door. His humility impressed the neighbors and gradually won their acceptance. "Never seen a rich man willing to get his hands dirty for someone else's benefit," Patrick murmured to his son as they worked on the roof. "Makes you think there might be more to Clayton McQuade than his reputation suggests." Alma overheard the comment and felt a flush of protective pride. Whatever Clayton's motivations, his actions spoke more clearly than any words about his character. He'd chosen to spend his Christmas helping strangers, working alongside common farmers without condescension, treating her children with respect and kindness. As afternoon approached, the cabin neared completion. The door hung straight and true, the chinking sealed every gap, and the roof promised to shed rain and snow effectively. Inside, the space felt warm and protected, ready to shelter her family through the harshest weather Montana could deliver. "We should talk about supplies," Clayton said quietly to Alma as they took a brief rest. "You'll need more than what you've got stored to make it through until spring." The reminder of practical necessities brought her back to earth from the glow of accomplishment. Food, fuel, medicinal, the things that required money she didn't have. "I've been rationing what we have," she said. "We can make it stretch if we're careful." Clayton's expression grew serious. "Alma, you're carrying a child and nursing will require extra nutrition. The twins are growing and need proper food to stay healthy. This isn't the time for false pride." Before she could respond, another contraction gripped her, stronger than the previous ones, and lasting long enough to make her gasp. When it passed, she found Clayton watching her with sharp concern. "How long since the last one?" he asked. "Maybe an hour," she admitted. "They're not regular yet, but they're getting stronger." Clayton nodded grimly. "We need to finish up here and get you settled inside. That baby's making ready whether we are or not." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the falling snow. She'd been so focused on completing the cabin that she'd tried to ignore the signs her body was giving her. But babies came on their own schedule, and hers seemed determined to arrive in the middle of a Montana winter. As evening approached, the neighbors prepared to leave, satisfied that the widow and her children would have adequate shelter. Sarah Henderson's parting words carried grudging approval. "You've done well, Alma. Thomas would be proud of what you've accomplished." The validation from such an unlikely source meant more than Alma could easily express. She'd proven herself capable of completing her husband's vision, not through her own efforts alone, but through the wisdom to accept help when it was offered with genuine kindness. After the others left, Clayton helped them move their few possessions into the finished cabin. The space felt miraculous after months of living in canvas and tar paper solid walls that would hold against any storm, a roof that wouldn't leak, windows that could be shuttered against the cold. "Tomorrow I'll bring supplies," Clayton said as they settled around the fire for their first evening in the completed home. "Food, medicines, whatever else you need to get through the winter safely." Clayton, Alma began, but he held up a hand. This isn't charity, he said firmly. This is investment in the future. Your children are going to grow up strong and capable, and someday they'll help other families the way we helped you. That's how communities survive, by taking care of each other when times get hard. As they prepared for sleep in their new home, Alma felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The cabin stood complete and solid around them, proof that impossible dreams could become reality, with enough determination and the right kind of help. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the walls they'd raised together, 3 generations of the Carlisle family slept peacefully, protected not just by logs and chinking, but by the knowledge that they'd found an unexpected ally in their struggle to build a new life from the ashes of loss. The pressed wildflower lay on the mantelpiece, its summer beauty preserved through winter's trial, a reminder that hope could survive even the harshest seasons if properly tended and carefully protected. The third morning arrived with the storm that Clayton had predicted, bringing wind that howled like a living thing and snow that fell in sheets so thick they could barely see the lean-to where their horses sheltered. Alma woke to contractions that came with increasing regularity, each one a reminder that her body was preparing for birth, whether conditions were favorable or not. Clayton had spent the night in the cabin's main room, maintaining the fire and keeping watch, while the family slept in the small alcove they'd partitioned off for privacy. When Alma emerged to find him reading from Thomas's worn Bible, she felt a complex mix of gratitude and something deeper in awareness that this man's presence had become essential to her family's well-being in ways that went beyond mere construction assistance. The family Bible lay open in his weathered hands, its leather binding cracked from years of frontier use. Thomas had carried it west from Ohio, and its pages held pressed flowers from their journey, margin notes in his careful script, and family records dating back 3 generations. It was their most precious possession, aside from the land deed, a repository of faith and memory that anchored them to something larger than their daily struggles. "I hope you don't mind," Clayton said, noting her attention to the book. "I couldn't sleep with the storm, and reading seemed better than just sitting in the dark." "Thomas would have liked that," Alma said, settling carefully beside the fire. "He always said the Bible was meant to be shared, not hoarded like some precious treasure that might get damaged by use." Clayton ran his finger along the margin where Thomas had written notes beside a passage in Ecclesiastes. "He had good handwriting," he observed, "and thoughtful commentary. This note about there being a season for everything, he wrote it like a man who'd seen enough of life to understand the wisdom in it." "He wrote that after our first winter here," Alma said, memory bringing both pain and comfort. "We nearly starved that year, living in a dugout while he cleared land for farming. But when spring came, and we saw what the land could produce," she touched her belly as another contraction began. "He said sometimes you had to endure the dying season to appreciate the time for being born." The contraction was stronger than the others, lasting long enough to make her breathing change. Clayton set the Bible aside and moved closer, his attention focused entirely on her condition. "They're coming faster," he said, not asking but observing. "Yes," Alma admitted. "Maybe every 30 minutes now." Clayton nodded thoughtfully. "We need to make preparations. I've assisted with difficult births before, but it's been years since Sarah died. I'll need you to remind me if I forget anything important." The practical way he approached the situation calmed her fears. Too many men treated childbirth as a mysterious female affliction, but Clayton discussed it like any other natural process that required skill and preparation to manage safely. Reed appeared from the sleeping alcove, rubbing his eyes and looking concerned about the storm battering their cabin. "Is the roof going to hold?" he asked, flinching as a particularly strong gust made the whole structure shudder. "Built to last," Clayton assured him. "Your papa chose good timber, and we got the joints tight. Takes more than wind to bring down a properly built cabin." The boy's face relaxed at the confident words. At 9 years old, Reed carried too much responsibility for his family's welfare, and adult reassurance meant everything to his peace of mind. Rosie joined them by the fire, her arms wrapped around the worn doll that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. The toy's fabric dress was faded and patched, but it represented continuity with better times when parents were alive to provide comfort and security. "The baby's going to come today, isn't it?" she said with the directness children brought to important questions. Alma exchanged glances with Clayton, recognizing that honesty served better than false comfort. "Probably," she said. "Are you ready to help take care of your new brother or sister?" Rosie straightened with pride. "I've been practicing with my doll. I know how to hold babies so their heads don't wobble, and I can sing the lullaby Mama taught me." The storm intensified as the morning progressed, transforming their newly completed cabin into an island of warmth, surrounded by nature's fury. Clayton moved methodically through preparations, boiling water, organizing clean cloths, and arranging the sleeping area to accommodate the coming birth. His calm efficiency reassured Alma more than words could have. "Tell me about when you were born," Clayton said to the twins, clearly trying to distract them from their mother's increasingly obvious discomfort. "Did your papa ever share that story?" Reed's face lit up with the memory. "He said we came so fast the doctor almost missed it. Mama was hanging laundry when her pains started, and by the time Papa got back from town with help, we were already here." "Both of us at once," Rosie added importantly. "Papa said I came first, so I'm the older twin, even though it was only by 2 minutes. And I came out holding her foot," Reed said with 9-year-old pride in the dramatic details. "Papa said I was trying to pull her back so I could be first." The familiar story made them all smile, creating a sense of continuity between past and present. These children had been born into love and hope, and despite the hardships they'd endured, that foundation remained strong enough to support them through whatever came next. Another contraction gripped Alma, this one intense enough to make her grasp Clayton's hand without conscious thought. His fingers closed around hers with gentle strength, anchoring her through the wave of pain until it passed. "Getting stronger," he observed quietly. "And closer together," she confirmed, noting how little time had passed since the previous one. Clayton nodded, his expression serious but not panicked. "We should talk about what comes after," he said. "This baby's going to need more than just a safe birth. You'll need help during recovery, and the children will need care while you're healing." The practical concerns he raised had been troubling Alma's sleep for weeks. A new mother couldn't manage a homestead alone, especially during winter recovery. But accepting more help meant deepening her obligation to a man she was already indebted to beyond any reasonable hope of repayment. "I've been thinking about that," she said carefully. "Maybe I could take in washing or sewing from town, something to earn enough to hire help when I need it." Clayton's expression grew gentle but firm. "Alma, you're going to have a newborn and 2 other children to care for. This isn't the time to worry about earning money. This is the time to focus on healing and bonding with your baby." "But I can't keep accepting your charity," she protested, even as another contraction began building. "I have to find a way to be self-sufficient." "Who says anything about charity?" Clayton asked. "I'm talking about partnership. You need help, and I need—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I need to remember what it feels like to be part of a family again." The honesty in his voice stopped her protests. She could see the loneliness he carried, carefully hidden behind competence and self-reliance. His wealth had isolated him as much as her poverty had isolated her, leaving both of them struggling with burdens that could be lightened by sharing them. "What kind of partnership?" she asked, though speaking was becoming difficult as the contractions intensified. "The kind where we help each other through the hard times," Clayton said simply. "You need practical support right now. Later, when you're stronger, maybe I'll need something you can provide. That's how real partnerships work, not keeping score, but trusting that things balance out over time." Reed looked up from where he was tending the fire. Like how Papa and the neighbors used to help each other with harvest. Nobody counted hours or measured exactly equal work. They just did what needed doing when it needed doing. "Exactly like that," Clayton confirmed. "Your Papa understood how communities survive, people looking out for each other, sharing burdens when they get too heavy for one person to carry alone." The philosophical discussion was interrupted by Alma's sharp intake of breath as her strongest contraction yet gripped her. When it passed, she found Clayton studying her with professional concern. "I think we need to move you to the bed," he said. "These are coming too fast and too strong for early labor." As they helped her settle into the sleeping alcove, Alma felt a mix of fear and anticipation, unlike anything she'd experienced with the twins' birth. Then, Thomas had been beside her, sharing the worry and wonder of bringing new life into the world. Now she faced the same miracle with a man who was still largely a stranger, despite the intimacy of their shared work. But as Clayton arranged clean linens and spoke quietly to the twins about their roles as helpers, Alma realized that strangers could become family through shared trials. The man who'd appeared 3 days ago as a helpful neighbor had become something more essential, partner in the most fundamental sense, someone willing to share both burden and joy without counting the cost. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, but inside their solid cabin, surrounded by warmth and care, Alma prepared to bring Thomas's final gift into a world made safer by unexpected alliances and the kind of love that could grow between people who chose to trust each other when trust mattered most. The family Bible lay open on the table, its pages reflecting firelight, as another contraction announced that new life was determined to join their unlikely family, storm or no storm, ready or not. The afternoon brought both intensifying labor and an unexpected sound that cut through the storms, howling the jingle of harness bells and the creak of wagon wheels fighting through heavy snow. Clayton moved to the window, peering through the gap in the shutters at shapes materializing through the white curtain of falling snow. "Neighbors," he said with satisfaction, "Patrick Mulligan and his son, by the look of it, and they've brought supplies." Alma felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with her contractions. In the isolation of frontier life, neighbors traveling through a blizzard to check on a laboring woman represented the finest expression of human community. These people had their own families to protect, their own struggles to manage, yet they'd risked the dangerous journey because someone needed help. Patrick and Michael Mulligan stamped snow from their boots as they entered, their arms loaded with packages wrapped in oiled cloth. Behind them came Sarah Henderson, her stern expression softened by concern, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and medicinal herbs. "How's she doing?" Patrick asked Clayton directly, man to man, in the way frontier folk discussed serious matters without wasting time on social pleasantries. "Labor's progressing fast," Clayton replied. "Maybe 2 hours, maybe less. Good thing you're here, we can use experienced hands." Sarah Henderson bustled past the men, taking charge with the efficiency of a woman who'd assisted at dozens of births. "Alma, dear, let me look at you. I've brought everything we might need: clean linens, willow bark tea for the pain, and my grandmother's recipe for strengthening broth." The presence of another woman transformed Alma's anxiety into relief. Sarah's competence and experience would ensure that nothing went wrong that human skill could prevent. More importantly, her children would have multiple adults caring for them during the intense hours ahead. Michael Mulligan began unpacking supplies with quiet efficiency flour, salt pork, dried beans, and luxuries like real coffee and white sugar that Alma hadn't tasted in months. Clayton's silver pocket watch lay among the provisions, its chain broken and its case dented. "Traded that for the supplies," Clayton explained when he noticed her staring. "Time's just numbers on a dial, but food keeps families alive through winter." The casual sacrifice of something clearly valuable and personally meaningful took Alma's breath away. The watch had obviously belonged to Clayton for years, its surface worn smooth by handling, its mechanical precision suggesting both quality and sentimental value. To trade such a possession for staples her family needed demonstrated a generosity that went beyond mere neighborliness. "Clayton, you can't," she began, but another contraction cut off her protest. "Already done," he said firmly. "Besides, what good's a timepiece to a man who's got nowhere urgent to be?" Patrick nodded approvingly at the sentiment. Possessions should serve people, not the other way around. Your young man here understands what matters most. The casual reference to Clayton as your young man should have scandalized the gathering, but instead it settled over them with the natural acceptance of people who'd seen how crisis could reshape social boundaries. In this isolated cabin, surrounded by storm and focused on the fundamental business of bringing life safely into the world, conventional proprieties seemed less important than human connection. Reed and Rosie had taken charge of organizing the supplies, working with the focused competence children developed when adult concerns became their own. They moved quietly but efficiently, understanding that their mother needed calm surroundings for the work ahead. "The baby's coming soon," Rosie announced with 9-year-old certainty, studying her mother's face with the intensity children brought to reading adult emotions. "Mama gets that look when something important's about to happen." Sarah Henderson smiled at the child's perception. "You're right, sweetheart. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient for the rest of us." This little one's decided that Christmas week is the perfect time for making an appearance. As if summoned by her words, Alma felt the unmistakable pressure that signaled the final stage of labor. The baby was indeed coming, driven by forces beyond anyone's control to enter a world of storm and candlelight, surrounded by people who'd become family through shared crisis. "Clayton," she called, reaching for his hand as the most intense contraction yet gripped her. "I need you here." He moved to her side without hesitation, his weathered face calm despite the intimacy of the situation. "I'm here," he said simply. "We all are. You're not doing this alone." The next hour passed in a blur of concentrated effort, with Sarah Henderson directing the process and Clayton providing steady support while the twins maintained the fire and Patrick stood ready to assist however needed. The cabin filled with the ancient rhythm of birth-breathing, pushing, encouraging words, and the patient work of bringing new life safely into existence. When the baby finally arrived with a cry that cut through the storm's noise, the room filled with the kind of silence that follows miracles. Clayton held the tiny, perfect child, while Sarah cleaned and examined the infant with expert hands. "A daughter," Sarah announced with satisfaction. "Small but strong, with good color and excellent lungs." Alma accepted her baby with trembling hands, overwhelmed by emotions too complex for words. Relief, joy, exhaustion, and gratitude mingled with the fierce, protective love that transformed women into mothers. The child was beautiful dark hair like her own, but Thomas's determined chin and what looked like Clayton's pale eyes. "She's perfect," Reed breathed, touching his sister's tiny fist with reverent gentleness. "What will you name her?" Rosie asked, already assuming her role as protective big sister. Alma looked down at the baby, then around the room at the faces of people who'd become her chosen family. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." The name settled over them with rightness that needed no explanation. This child represented hope, made manifest hope that Thomas's dreams would survive, hope that love could grow from loss, hope that strangers could become family when people chose to care for each other. As Sarah Henderson helped clean up and the men settled the baby into a makeshift cradle Patrick had carved from a wooden crate, Alma felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Her family was whole again, not in the way it had been, but in a new configuration that honored the past while embracing possibilities she'd never imagined. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but inside the cabin they'd built together, surrounded by warmth and the satisfied exhaustion that follows great achievement. 3 generations of Carlisles welcomed their newest member, while their chosen family shared the quiet joy of witnessing life's most fundamental miracle. Clayton's pocket watch lay forgotten among the scattered supplies, its sacrifice having purchased more than mere provisions. It had bought them time, time to heal, time to grow, time to discover what kinds of love could flourish when people chose to build something beautiful from the raw materials of loss and hope and the willingness to work together toward a common goal. Baby Hope slept peacefully in her father's arms. unaware that she'd been born into a family defined not by blood alone but by the deeper bonds that formed when people chose to care for each other through life's hardest seasons. 3 days after Hope's birth, as Alma was beginning to feel stronger and the storm had finally blown itself out, Reed made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about Clayton's presence in their lives. The boy had been helping to organize the cabin's interior when he noticed something odd about one of the foundation's stone's deliberate gap that seemed designed to hide something. "Mama," he called from where he knelt beside the hearth. "There's something stuck behind this rock." Alma, still weak from childbirth but curious about her son's find, made her way over to where Reed was carefully extracting a piece of oiled cloth from the hidden crevice. Inside the wrapping was a letter, written in Thomas's familiar hand, but addressed to someone she'd never expected. "It's for Mr. Clayton," Reed said, examining the envelope. "But why would Papa write to him? Did they know each other?" Alma's hands trembled as she accepted the letter, her mind racing with implications she didn't want to consider. Clayton had presented himself as a stranger, moved by neighborly concern. But if Thomas had known him well enough to leave him a letter— "What does it say?" Rosie asked, crowding close with the innocent curiosity of a child, unaware that adult secrets could shatter carefully constructed truths. Before Alma could respond, Clayton himself appeared in the doorway, returning from checking on the horses. His face went pale when he saw the letter in her hands, confirming her worst suspicions about deception and hidden motives. "Alma," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice carrying a disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Just don't. Let me read what my husband really thought about you before you try to explain away whatever lies you've been telling us." With shaking fingers, she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning Thomas's careful script while her heart prepared for betrayal. But what she read wasn't what she'd expected at all. "Clayton, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Alma found this letter like I hoped she would. I know she's proud, probably too proud to accept help, even when she needs it desperately. But you promised me you'd watch over my family if something happened to me, and I'm holding you to that promise. I met you that day in town when the doctor told me about the growth in my chest. You were just a stranger then, but when you saw how scared I was about leaving Alma and the children alone, you offered something no one else would. You said you'd make sure they had what they needed to survive. Not charity, you said, but the kind of help neighbors give each other when times get hard. I know Alma. She'll fight accepting assistance, especially from a man she doesn't know. But if you can find a way to help her that preserves her dignity, maybe make it seem like coincidence or natural neighborliness, she might let you do what I can't. The homestead means everything to her, no, which the only piece of me she has left to hold on to. Help her keep it if you can. Help her believe in herself again. And if God's willing, and your heart's open to it, maybe help her remember that life doesn't end when someone you love dies. I'm trusting you with the most precious things in my world. Don't let me down. Thomas Carlisle. Alma read the letter twice, her emotions shifting from betrayal through confusion to something she couldn't quite name. Clayton hadn't lied to her exactly, but he hadn't told her the whole truth either. His help hadn't been the spontaneous generosity of a passing stranger, but the fulfillment of a promise made to her dying husband. "You knew," she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes. "You knew Thomas was dying, and you promised to take care of us." Clayton nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the strain of carrying secrets. "I met him in town 3 weeks before he died. He'd just come from the doctor, and he looked like a man who'd seen his own grave. We got to talking, and when he told me about you and the children, about the homestead he might not live to complete. You offered to watch over the widow and orphans." Alma finished, her voice flat with the effort of controlling her emotions. "Like some kind of charitable obligation." "No," Clayton said firmly, stepping closer despite her obvious anger. "Not like charity. Like a promise between men who understood what family means. Thomas loved you and those children more than his own life. When he asked me to make sure you'd be safe if something happened to him, I couldn't refuse." Reed looked between the adults, trying to understand the currents of emotion swirling around them. "But you still helped us," he said to Clayton. "You still taught me how to build and brought us food and stayed with us during the storm." "Yes," Clayton said, his attention focused on the boy's earnest face. "I did all those things, but not because I felt obligated to. I did them because your family became important to me for reasons that had nothing to do with any promise." Alma felt tears threatening, overwhelmed by the complexity of discovering that what she'd thought was spontaneous kindness had actually been planned assistance. Part of her was grateful that Thomas had found a way to provide for them even after death. But another part felt diminished, as if her own strength and capability had been discounted in favor of masculine arrangements made without her knowledge or consent. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Why let me think you were just some generous stranger instead of someone fulfilling an obligation to my dead husband?" Clayton was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Because I knew you'd refuse help if you thought it was charity or pity. Thomas warned me about your pride, said you'd rather struggle alone than accept assistance you couldn't repay. He thought, if I could make it seem natural, neighborly, you might let me help without feeling diminished by it." "So you lied to me," Alma said, though the accusation carried less heat than it might have. "I let you believe something that wasn't entirely true," Clayton admitted. "But everything else, the respect I have for you, the affection I've developed for your children, the feelings that have grown between us, none of that was part of any promise. That happened because of who you are, not because of any obligation to Thomas." The honesty in his voice made Alma's anger begin to crumble, replaced by confusion about what was real and what had been orchestrated. Had Clayton's growing attachment to her family been genuine, or was he just a man who honored his commitments regardless of personal cost? "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said quietly, sinking into the chair beside the hearth. "I thought I'd earned your respect through my own efforts. Now I find out you were always planning to help me no matter what." "You did earn my respect," Clayton said, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Thomas asked me to watch over you, but he didn't ask me to stay and work beside you for 3 days. He didn't ask me to deliver your baby, or trade my watch for supplies, or sleep on your floor to keep the fire going. I did those things because I wanted to, because you and your children gave my life meaning it hadn't had since Sarah died." Reed stepped forward, the letter still in his small hands. "Papa was smart," he said with 9-year-old logic. "He knew we'd need help, and he found someone good to give it to us. That doesn't make Mr. Clayton's help worth less. It just means Papa loved us enough to make sure we'd be safe." The simple wisdom in her son's words cut through Alma's emotional confusion. Thomas had known he was dying, and in his final weeks he'd made arrangements to protect his family. That didn't diminish her own strength or capability, it demonstrated his love and foresight. "What happens now?" she asked Clayton, her voice steadier than she felt. "Now that I know the truth about why you came here." Clayton stood slowly, his expression serious but hopeful. "Now you decide what you want to happen. The promise I made to Thomas is fulfilled. You're safe, the cabin's built, you have supplies to last the winter. I could ride away and consider my obligation met." "But," Alma prompted, hearing something in his tone that suggested alternatives. "But I'd rather stay if you'll have me, not because of any promise, but because I've found something here I thought I'd lost forever. A purpose beyond managing cattle and counting money. A family that needs what I have to offer and gives me what I need in return." Rosie looked up from where she'd been tending baby Hope. "Are you asking to be part of our family for real?" she said with characteristic directness, "not just because Papa asked you to watch over us." Clayton smiled at the child's forthright question. "Yes, sweetheart, that's exactly what I'm asking. If your mama thinks it's a good idea." Alma looked around the cabin they'd built together, solid walls that would protect her children, a warm hearth that would see them through winter, space enough for Hope to grow alongside them. Then she looked at Clayton, this complicated man whose deception had been motivated by kindness and whose help had been genuine, regardless of its origins. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This changes things, knowing about the promise. I need to understand what's real and what's obligation." Clayton nodded with understanding rather than disappointment. "Take all the time you need. I'll be at the ranch when you're ready to talk. But Alma—" He paused, his pale eyes serious. "Don't let Thomas's foresight make you doubt your own strength. You would have found a way to survive even without my help. All I did was make it easier." As he gathered his gear and prepared to leave, baby Hope began crying for the first time since her birth. Alma lifted her daughter, struck by how this newest life represented both ending and beginning the completion of Thomas's legacy and the start of possibilities none of them had imagined. The hidden letter had revealed truths that complicated everything, but it had also shown her that love could work in ways she'd never expected. Thomas's final gift hadn't just been protection for his family, it had been the chance for all of them to discover that strength shared was stronger than strength alone, and that families could be built from choice as well as blood. Outside, snow continued to fall gently, covering the world in fresh possibilities while inside the cabin, surrounded by evidence of what could be accomplished when people worked together toward common goals. Alma held her newborn daughter and contemplated futures she was finally ready to believe might be possible. For 2 weeks after Clayton's departure, Alma wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The cabin felt different without his presence, still warm and secure, but somehow incomplete, like a song missing its harmony. She found herself listening for the sound of his horse's hooves, watching the horizon for a rider who didn't come, and struggling to separate her gratitude from deeper feelings she wasn't ready to name. The twins, meanwhile, had no such complicated emotions about Clayton's absence. They missed him with the straightforward grief children felt when someone important disappeared from their lives, and they weren't shy about expressing their opinions on the matter. "He's not coming back, is he?" Reed asked one morning as he practiced the woodworking techniques Clayton had taught him. The boy had been carving a cradle for baby Hope, working with the focus of someone trying to prove he could complete important tasks without adult supervision. "I don't know, sweetheart," Alma replied honestly. "That depends on whether he wants to be part of our family for the right reasons, not just because he promised Papa he'd take care of us." Rosie looked up from where she was tending the fire, her 9-year-old face serious with thought. "But he did want to be part of our family. I could tell by how he looked at you, Mama. Papa used to look at you the same way, like you were the most important thing in his whole world." The perceptive comment made Alma's cheeks warm. She'd noticed Clayton's attention, but had attributed it to kindness rather than romantic interest. Now, with the clarity that came from his absence, she could acknowledge what her children had seen more clearly than she had. Clayton's feelings for her had developed beyond obligation into something deeper and more personal. But knowing that didn't solve her dilemma. Even if Clayton's affection was genuine, their relationship had begun with deception. How could she trust feelings that had grown from a foundation of hidden truths? And how could she be certain that her own emotions weren't simply gratitude disguised as love? The questions became more pressing when neighbors began arriving with advice, gossip, and thinly veiled pressure for her to make a decision about her future. Sarah Henderson appeared first, bringing medical herbs for baby Hope, but clearly more interested in discussing Alma's romantic prospects. "That McQuade fellow's been asking around town about how you're managing," Sarah said with the directness frontier women brought to important matters. "Seems like a man with intentions, if you ask me." "I didn't ask," Alma replied mildly, but Sarah was undeterred by the gentle rebuke. "Well, you should consider it," the older woman continued. "Winter's not half over, and managing a homestead with 3 children is more than any woman should attempt alone. Clayton McQuade's got the means to provide for you proper, and he's already shown he cares about your welfare." The practical argument carried weight that Alma couldn't ignore. Clayton could offer her children security, education, and opportunities she'd never be able to provide on her own. But marriage based on practical considerations rather than love had a way of breeding resentment over time, and she'd seen too many frontier couples trapped in unions that served economics better than happiness. Patrick Mulligan arrived the next day with a different perspective, bringing his wife Margaret to help with the children while he spoke to Alma privately about more serious concerns. "There's been talk in town," he said carefully, settling into the chair by the hearth that Clayton had favored during his stay. "Some folks are saying it's not proper for a young widow to be living alone way out here, especially with Clayton McQuade showing such obvious interest." Alma felt heat rise in her cheeks. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that hurts women's reputations and makes life difficult for their children," Patrick said bluntly. "Fair or not, people expect widows to behave a certain way. Taking help from a wealthy bachelor, especially one who's been staying in your cabin, sets tongues wagging." The unfairness of it made Alma's jaw clench with anger. Men could accept help from anyone without question. But let a woman work alongside a man to save her family, and suddenly she was subject to moral judgment. Clayton's reputation would emerge unscathed from any gossip, while hers could be destroyed by speculation about impropriety that existed only in small minds. "What are you suggesting I do?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Marry him or send him away permanent," Patrick said with frontier directness. "Those are your only choices if you want to protect your children's standing in the community." The ultimatum felt like a trap closing around her, limiting her options to extremes that served other people's comfort rather than her own needs. But Patrick was right about the potential consequences for her children. Reed and Rosie would grow up in this community, and their social acceptance could be damaged by gossip about their mother's relationship with Clayton McQuade. As if summoned by her thoughts about the future, Reed appeared in the doorway carrying the completed cradle he'd been working on. The piece was remarkably well crafted for a 9-year-old's work, showing both the techniques Clayton had taught him and improvements the boy had developed through his own experimentation. "I finished it," he announced with quiet pride, setting the cradle beside the hearth. "I carved both families' initials on the headboard, like Mr. Clayton showed me to do with the cabin door." Alma examined her son's work, noting the careful attention to detail and the symbolic significance of the intertwined letters C, M, and AC, joined in a decorative pattern that seemed to represent the merging of two separate lives into something stronger together. "It's beautiful, Reed," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "Your papa would be proud of the craftsman you're becoming." Mr. Clayton said a man's work should honor both what came before and what might come after. Reed replied seriously. "I wanted this cradle to show that hope belongs to all of us, you and me and Rosie, but also Mr. Clayton if he wants to be part of our family." The boy's simple wisdom cut through weeks of complicated adult reasoning. Children understood family in ways that weren't limited by social conventions or pride. They recognized love by its actions rather than its origins. And they were willing to embrace new configurations that served everyone's needs. That evening, as Alma sat beside the cradle Reed had carved, while baby Hope slept peacefully inside it, she made her decision. Not because of community pressure or economic necessity, but because her son's artistry had shown her something important about the nature of commitment. The initials carved into the headboard weren't just decorative, they were a declaration of intention, a statement that some connections were worth honoring regardless of how they began. Clayton's promise to Thomas had brought him into their lives, but what he'd built with them since that first meeting belonged to all of them equally. She spent the next morning writing a letter that took her 3 attempts to get right, choosing words that conveyed invitation rather than desperation, hope rather than obligation. When she finished, she gave the sealed envelope to Reed, with instructions for delivering it to the Circle M ranch. "Tell Mr. Clayton that we've finished his cradle," she said, knowing he would understand the deeper message contained in those simple words. As Reed rode away on their old mare, disappearing over the ridge that separated their homestead from Clayton's ranch, Alma felt the nervous anticipation that came with making irrevocable choices. She'd spent weeks trying to separate obligation from affection, duty from desire, and she'd finally realized the distinction didn't matter as much as the willingness to build something meaningful from whatever materials life provided. Whether Clayton came back because of Thomas's promise or his own feelings for her family, What mattered was what they chose to create together going forward. Love could grow from any beginning if people were willing to tend it carefully and trust it enough to take the risks that all meaningful relationships required. The cabin door that bore both their initials stood ready to welcome him home if he chose to return. And if he didn't, she and her children would continue building their lives with the strength they'd discovered through working alongside someone who'd shown them that the best partnerships honored the past while creating possibilities for the future that none of them could have imagined alone. Clayton received Reed's message while he was standing in his empty parlor, staring at the space where Sarah's piano had once filled the room with music and life. The boy's simple words, "Mama says we finished your cradle," carried meaning that went far beyond furniture completion, and Clayton felt his heart respond with a mixture of hope and trepidation he hadn't experienced since his wife's death. He'd spent the past 2 weeks wrestling with his own complicated emotions, trying to separate his promise to Thomas from his growing love for Alma and her children. Every day without them had felt hollow, but he'd forced himself to stay away, giving Alma the space she needed to decide what she wanted their relationship to become. Now, holding her invitation in his weathered hands, Clayton felt the same nervous anticipation he'd experienced as a young man preparing to propose to Sarah. The risk was enormous. Rejection would mean losing not just a romantic possibility, but the family connection that had given his life meaning again after years of wealthy isolation. "Mr. McQuade," Reed said from where he waited by the front door, his young face serious with the importance of his mission. "Mama also said to tell you that the doors still got both sets of initials, and that families can be built from choice as much as blood." The carefully delivered message made Clayton smile despite his nervousness. Alma had always possessed a gift for finding exactly the right words to express complex emotions, and her son's earnest delivery only emphasized the sincerity behind the invitation. "Tell your mama I'll be along directly," Clayton said, already moving toward the stairs to gather the belongings he'd been afraid to pack in case his hopes proved misplaced. Reed grinned with the satisfaction of a successful messenger. "She's been watching the ridge every day, waiting for you to come back. Rosie says Mama gets the same look Papa used to get when he was expecting someone important." The boy's innocent observation confirmed what Clayton had hoped, but hadn't dared assume that Alma's feelings for him had developed beyond gratitude or convenience into something deeper and more personal. The knowledge filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in his hearth. Within an hour, Clayton had loaded his wagon with carefully chosen items that represented his commitment to becoming part of the Carlisle family. Not the expensive furnishings that might seem like attempts to improve their humble cabin, but practical gifts that demonstrated understanding of their needs and respect for their independence. He'd brought fabric for making winter clothes for the children, books for Reed's education, seeds for next spring's garden, and tools that would help them expand their homestead as the family grew. Most importantly, he carried the components for a proper wedding ring, silver, melted down from his pocket watch and shaped by the blacksmith into a band that would symbolize the transformation of material wealth into lasting commitment. The ride to the Carlisle homestead felt both endless and too brief, giving Clayton time to rehearse conversations he hoped to have, while simultaneously worrying that words might prove inadequate for expressing the depth of his intentions. By the time he crested the ridge and saw smoke rising from their chimney, his hands were sweating despite the February cold. Alma met him at the cabin door, her face showing a mixture of nervousness and welcome that matched his own emotional state. She dressed carefully for his arrival, not in her work clothes, but in the blue dress she'd worn to church before Thomas's death, its color bringing out the green in her eyes and reminding Clayton that she was still a young woman, despite the responsibilities that had aged her beyond her years. "You came," she said simply, her voice carrying relief and something else he dared hope might be joy. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Clayton asked, dismounting and moving toward her with the careful steps of a man approaching something precious that might prove fragile. "I hoped you would," Alma admitted. "But I wasn't certain whether you'd come because you wanted to or because you felt you had to." Clayton stopped, just close enough to take her hands in his, noting how her work-roughened fingers felt warm and steady in his grasp. "I came because I can't imagine being anywhere else," he said with the honesty that had become his default when speaking to this remarkable woman. "These past 2 weeks without you and the children have shown me what my life looks like without purpose, and I don't want to live that way anymore." Rosie appeared in the doorway behind her mother, baby Hope cradled in her arms with the careful competence of a 9-year-old who'd appointed herself chief assistant caregiver. "Mr. Clayton," she called with unrestrained delight. "Hope's gotten bigger since you left, and Reed finished the cradle, and Mama's been cooking your favorite cornbread every day, hoping you'd come back to eat it." The enthusiastic greeting broke the tension between the adults, making them both laugh at the child's matter-of-fact revelation of family secrets. Clayton felt his nervousness ease as he remembered that whatever happened between him and Alma, he'd already been accepted unconditionally by her children. "I brought presents," he announced, moving toward the wagon to begin unloading his carefully chosen gifts. "And I was hoping we could talk about making some permanent arrangements." Reed emerged from the cabin carrying the completed cradle, his face bright with pride in his craftsmanship. "Look what I made," he said, setting the piece where Clayton could examine it properly. "I carved both families' initials like you taught me to show how they can fit together into something stronger." Clayton knelt beside the cradle, running his hands along the smooth wood and noting the skill Reed had developed in just 2 weeks of independent practice. But it was the symbolic meaning of the intertwined initials that made his throat tight with emotion, CM and AC, joined together in a pattern that spoke of permanence and mutual commitment. "It's beautiful work," he said seriously, meeting the boy's eyes with the respect due one craftsman addressing another. "Your papa would be proud of what you've accomplished." "He learned from a good teacher," Alma said softly, her hand resting on Reed's shoulder. "Someone who understood that the best education comes from working alongside adults who treat children as capable partners rather than burdens to be managed." The praise carried weight beyond mere politeness. It was acknowledgement of the relationship Clayton had built with her children, recognition that his influence on their lives had been positive and lasting. More than any romantic declaration, her words confirmed that she saw him as genuinely part of their family rather than merely a helpful outsider. As they moved into the cabin's warmth, Clayton felt the rightness of being in this space again. The room felt complete with his presence, just as his life felt complete when shared with people who needed what he could offer, while giving him purpose and connection in return. Baby Hope began crying, and Alma moved to tend her daughter with the fluid competence of an experienced mother. Watching her care for the child Thomas's final gift and legacy, Clayton felt the last of his doubts dissolve. Whatever complicated emotions had brought them together, what mattered now was their willingness to build something meaningful from the foundation they'd already established. "Alma," he said quietly, waiting until she looked up from settling the baby, "I need you to know that I'm not here because of any promise I made to Thomas. I'm here because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life helping you raise these children and whatever other children God might bless us with." The directness of his declaration seemed to surprise her, but her eyes filled with tears that looked more like relief than distress. "I love you too," she said simply, "not because you saved us or provided for us, but because you saw our family's worth when we couldn't see it ourselves and helped us remember that we were strong enough to build something beautiful from loss." Reed and Rosie exchanged pleased glances, clearly delighted that the adults had finally said what the children had understood for weeks. The newborn blanket wrapped around baby Hope seemed to glow in the firelight, its threads representing the weaving together of separate lives into a new pattern that honored the past, while embracing possibilities none of them could have imagined alone. The proposal itself came that evening as they sat around the fire, baby Hope sleeping peacefully in the cradle Reed had carved, while the twins worked on their lessons by lamplight. Clayton had been waiting for the right moment, but realized that with this family, the right moment was simply when they were together, engaged in the ordinary business of living. "Alma," he said, setting down the coffee cup she'd filled for him, "I have something I'd like to ask you." She looked up from the sewing that occupied her hands during quiet evening hours, her needle pausing mid-stitch as she gave him her full attention. The twins continued their work, but with the alertness children showed when they sensed important adult conversations developing. Clayton reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the ring he'd had made from his melted watcher. Simple silver band that gleamed with the warmth of candlelight, but carried none of the ostentation that might make Alma uncomfortable. About accepting it. "I know we've only known each other a few weeks," he began, then stopped and started over with better honesty. "Actually, that's not true. I feel like I've known you and your children much longer than that, like I've been waiting my whole life for this family without realizing what I was waiting for." Reed looked up from his arithmetic, his young face serious with understanding that this moment would reshape their lives in ways he couldn't fully grasp, but instinctively recognized as important. "What I'm trying to say," Clayton continued, dropping to one knee beside Alma's chair, in the traditional gesture that made Rosie gasp with excitement, "is that I'd like to marry you. Not because Thomas asked me to watch over you, and not because you need someone to provide for you, but because I love you and want to build a life together that honors what we've both lost while creating something new for all of us." Alma set down her sewing with hands that trembled slightly, her eyes moving from Clayton's face to the ring he offered to the children who watched with barely contained anticipation. The weight of the decision seemed to settle over her like a blanket, warm but substantial, something that would change everything if she accepted it. "Clayton," she said softly, "are you certain you want to take on 3 children and all the complications that come with them? Reed and Rosie have been through so much, and Hope will need a father's guidance as she grows. Marriage to me means accepting responsibility for all of us." "I know exactly what I'm asking for," Clayton replied with conviction. "I'm asking to be Reed's father when he needs guidance learning to be a man. I'm asking to be Rosie's father when she needs someone to teach her that she's valuable and strong and capable of anything she sets her mind to. I'm asking to be Hope's father in every way that matters, to love her and protect her and help her understand that families can be built from choice as much as blood." Rosie couldn't contain herself any longer. "Say yes, Mama," she burst out. "He already loves us, and we love him, and Papa would want you to be happy again." Reed nodded agreement with his sister's enthusiastic endorsement. "Mr. Clayton knows how to build things that last," he added with 9-year-old logic. "He can help us build a family that won't break when hard times come." The children's eager support seemed to give Alma the permission she needed to follow her heart rather than her worries. She looked around the cabin they'd built together, solid walls that had sheltered them through the worst winter weather, a warm hearth that promised continued comfort, space enough for love to grow alongside them. "Yes," she said simply, extending her hand so Clayton could slide the ring onto her finger. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need rescue or security, but because I love you and believe we can build something beautiful together." The ring fitted perfectly, its simple elegance exactly right for a woman who valued substance over show. Clayton remained kneeling beside her chair, overwhelming relief and joy, making him temporarily speechless as he absorbed the reality that she'd accepted his proposal. Reed and Rosie erupted in celebration, their careful attention to adult propriety abandoned in favor of childhood excitement about the future their family would share. Even baby Hope seemed to respond to the emotional atmosphere, making the soft cooing sounds that had become her way of participating in family conversations. "When?" Rosie asked, with the practical urgency children brought to important questions. "When will you get married? And can I be in the wedding? And will Mr. Clayton live here with us all the time now?" "Soon," Alma laughed, reaching out to draw her daughter close. "As soon as we can arrange for the minister to come out from town. And yes, you can absolutely be in the wedding. In fact, you and Reed will be the most important guests, because you're the ones who'll be gaining a new father." Clayton stood slowly, his weathered face showing emotions too complex for easy expression. "I want to adopt the children legally." he said seriously. "Make them McQuades as well as Carlisles, so they'll have the protection of my name and the security of knowing they belong to me completely." The offer represented more than legal formality. It was a commitment to claim Reed, Rosie, and Hope as his own children, in every way society recognized, giving them access to his resources and social position while acknowledging their permanent place in his heart. "What about Thomas?" Reed asked, with the concern children showed for maintaining connection to lost parents. "He'll still be our papa too, won't he?" "Always," Clayton confirmed without hesitation. "Your papa will always be the man who gave you life and taught you important lessons about courage and determination. I'm just asking to be the man who helps you grow up and learns from you about what it means to be part of a real family." As they settled the practical details of their engagement, when to hold the ceremony, which neighbors to invite, how to merge their households, Clayton felt the profound satisfaction that came from making choices that served everyone's needs while honoring everyone's feelings. The hearthstone he'd helped lay during those first crucial days now anchored a fire that would burn for generations, warming not just one family, but the extended community of people who'd chosen to support each other through life's challenges. The foundation they'd built together, physical and emotional, was strong enough to support whatever future they chose to construct. Outside, February wind rattled the windows, but inside their solid cabin, 5 people who'd become family through shared struggle and mutual choice, prepared to formalize bonds that had already proven stronger than blood alone. The hand-forged ring that symbolized transformation of material wealth into lasting commitment caught the firelight, promising that some changes, once made with genuine love and careful thought, could indeed last forever. Baby Hope slept peacefully in her carved cradle, unaware that she was about to gain not just a father, but entry into a legacy of people who understood that the best families were built by those willing to work together toward common goals, sharing both burdens and joys while creating something larger than any of them could achieve alone. Spring arrived in Montana, with the gradual warmth that made winter's hardships feel like distant memories. By May, wildflowers carpeted the meadow surrounding the Carlisle homestead, and the creek ran full with snowmelt that promised abundant water for the gardens Clayton and Alma planned to plant together. The wedding had taken place in March, conducted by the circuit minister in their own cabin, with the entire community in attendance. Sarah Henderson had surprised everyone by organizing the women to provide a proper wedding feast, while Patrick Mulligan and his sons had brought fiddles to ensure the celebration included dancing late into the evening. Now, as Alma stood in the doorway of their home, watching Clayton teach Reed to break a young horse, while Rosie gathered eggs from the chickens they'd acquired, she felt the deep contentment that came from seeing Thomas's dreams fulfilled in ways he never could have imagined. The homestead had grown beyond the simple cabin they'd built that desperate winter. Clayton's resources and connections had enabled them to add a proper barn, a root cellar, and a workshop where Reed could practice the woodworking skills that were becoming his passion. But more importantly, they'd built the kind of community Thomas had, envisioned neighbors helping neighbors, children learning from multiple adults, families supporting each other through both hardships and celebrations. Baby Hope, now 6 months old and thriving, had become the unofficial mascot of their extended family. She spent her days being passed between willing caregivers, each adult contributing to her education and development. Reed and Rosie had embraced their roles as protective older siblings, while Clayton demonstrated the patient gentleness that made him a natural father to children who weren't his by blood, but were completely his by choice. "Mrs. McQuade," called a voice from behind her, and Alma turned to see Margaret Mulligan approaching with a basket of fresh bread and the latest community news. The title still felt strange after months of use, but Alma had grown comfortable with the way it represented her new place in the social order. Marriage to Clayton had given her family security and standing, but more importantly, it had given them the kind of love that made individual strengths multiply rather than diminish. "Margaret," she replied warmly, accepting the bread with gratitude. "Come in and have coffee. I want to hear how your Patrick's recovering from his back injury." As the women settled around the kitchen table, Clayton had built to accommodate their expanded family, baby Hope gurgling contentedly in her mother's arms. Alma reflected on how profoundly their lives had changed since that desperate Christmas Eve when she'd been chopping frozen sod, with contractions beginning. "You look happy," Margaret observed, with the directness frontier women brought to important topics. "Content in a way you never did when Thomas was alive, if you'll forgive me saying so." The comment might have offended another woman, but Alma understood what Margaret meant. Her marriage to Thomas had been built on young love and shared dreams, but it had also carried the weight of his ambitious plans and her constant worry about their financial survival. Her relationship with Clayton was different, deeper, more equal, founded on mutual respect and the knowledge that they'd both survived loss and chosen to build something new from the lessons life had taught them. "Thomas and I were children when we married," Alma said thoughtfully. "We loved each other, but we were still learning who we were individually. Clayton and I came together as adults who knew what we could offer and what we needed. That makes for a different kind of partnership." Through the window, she could see Clayton patiently explaining something to Reed. Their heads bent together over a piece of equipment in a way that reminded her powerfully of the relationship Reed had been developing with his father before Thomas's death. But this wasn't replacement or substitution, it was continuation. The natural evolution of a boy's need for male guidance being met by a man who understood the responsibility such trust represented. The hand-forged wedding ring Clayton had made from his melted pocket watch caught the afternoon sunlight. Its simple silver surface, reflecting the light in ways that seemed to symbolize how valuable things could be transformed into different forms of value without losing their essential worth. Time had become something more precious than punctuality. It had become the gift of shared moments that created lasting memories. "Have you heard about the new family settling near Willow Creek?" Margaret asked, steering the conversation toward the kind of community news that kept frontier families connected despite the distances between their homes. "The Andersons," Alma replied. "Clayton mentioned they were having trouble getting their cabin finished before winter. We were thinking of organizing a barn raising, like the community did for us." The easy way she referred to community assistance for her own family demonstrated how much her perspective had changed. What had once felt like charity now seemed like the natural circulation of help that kept frontier communities strong. They'd received support when they needed it. Now they were in position to provide the same kind of assistance to newcomers facing similar challenges. As the afternoon wore on and neighbors continued arriving for the informal gathering that had become their family's tradition, Alma marveled at how their small cabin had become a social center for the scattered community. Clayton's wealth had made it possible to be generous with hospitality, but it was the warmth they'd all created together that made people want to return. Reed burst through the door with the energy of an 11-year-old who'd mastered something difficult, his face glowing with pride and excitement. "Mama, did you see? I got Thunder to take the bit without fighting, and Mr. Clayton says I've got natural instincts for working with horses." The boy had grown taller and stronger over the winter, but more importantly, he'd developed the quiet confidence that came from having adults who believed in his capabilities and gave him meaningful responsibilities. Clayton's influence had been transformative, but in ways that honored rather than replaced Thomas's early guidance. "I saw," Alma said, pulling her son close for a quick embrace before he could escape back to his important work. "Your papa would be proud of the horseman you're becoming. Mr. Clayton says Papa's watching over us and helping guide my hands when I work with the animals." Reed said with the matter-of-fact, acceptance children brought to spiritual concepts. "He says people we love never really leave us. They just change the way they help us." The theological complexity of the statement might have challenged adult minds, but Reed accepted it as natural truth. Death had become not an ending but a transformation, allowing Thomas to remain part of their family story even as new chapters were written. As evening approached and the last neighbors departed for their own homes, the McQuade family settled into the peaceful routine that had become their norm. Clayton read to the children while Alma finished the day's household tasks, baby Hope content in her father's arms as his deep voice brought stories to life. "Clayton," Alma said as they prepared for bed in the room they now shared, "do you ever regret the promise you made to Thomas? Wonder how your life might have been different if you'd never met him?" Clayton considered the question seriously, as he did most things she asked him. "I regret that he had to die so young," he said finally. "But I can't regret the promise that brought me to you and the children. Sometimes I think Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he asked me to watch over his family. Maybe he saw something I couldn't see about what we all needed." The idea that Thomas might have orchestrated their meeting from beyond death was one they'd discussed before, always with the mix of wonder and acceptance that frontier life taught people about mysteries that couldn't be easily explained. Outside their bedroom window, the same Montana wind that had once threatened to destroy their incomplete cabin now whispered through the leaves of the trees Clayton had planted that spring cottonwoods and maples that would provide shade for generations yet come. The sound was peaceful rather than threatening, a reminder that some things built with love and determination could indeed withstand any storm. In the main room, the original hearthstone still anchored their fire, but it was surrounded now by comfortable furniture and children's toys and all the accumulated evidence of a family that had grown from desperate survival into comfortable prosperity. The cabin itself had been expanded twice, but its heart remained the space they'd completed together during those crucial winter days when the future had seemed so uncertain. The pressed wildflower rosy had given Clayton still held its place of honor on the mantelpiece, its summer beauty preserved through winter's trial, and now witnessing spring's renewal. Like their family, it had endured harsh seasons by being carefully tended and protected, emerging into warmer times with its essential beauty intact. As Alma settled into sleep beside the man who'd become her partner in every sense that mattered, she felt the profound gratitude that came from recognizing how much good could grow from loss if people remained open to unexpected possibilities. Thomas's death had seemed like an ending, but it had actually been a transformation, his love for his family, continuing to work in the world, through the connections he'd helped create, and the children he'd raised to carry forward his values. The future stretched ahead with promise now, filled with plans for expanding their homestead, educating their children, and continuing to build the kind of community where families supported each other through life's inevitable challenges. And someday, when their children were grown and had families of their own, they would tell stories about the winter when their mother and her twins built a cabin in freezing weather, and how a wealthy cowboy's willingness to help had transformed all their lives in ways that proved love could indeed build stronger foundations than walls alone ever could.